The Sithari orbital palace was alive. Not alive the way humans use the word when they talked about cities or markets or busy streets. Alive the way a lung is alive, expanding and contracting with slow, wet patience. Walls of hardened resin pulsing faintly with bioluminescent veins that mapped the Queen's neural network through every corridor and chamber and forgotten corner of the station. Sergeant Marin Cade hated it with professional specificity. She stood at the docking bay threshold and counted what mattered. 4 exits visible, 2 more probable behind the resin walls that kept rearranging themselves like a building with commitment issues. 6 Sithari guards in ceremonial armor that looked like sculpted bone, but probably stopped plasma rounds better than anything humans had ever manufactured. Her knees ached from the shuttle ride. 14 hours in a seat, designed for someone who apparently had no spine and enjoyed suffering. Smelled like recycled air and the ambassador's cologne, which had somehow infected every surface of the diplomatic transport like a chemical weapon nobody had the courage to report. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Ambassador Lowe said beside her, sweating through what Cade estimated was his second shirt of the day. "Real decorative," Cade said. The palace breathed around them as they walked, corridors shifting in subtle ways that her tactical mind screamed about every 3 seconds. The route they had taken no longer existed behind them, the walls having quietly rearranged into something new, and she was mapping a place that refused to stay mapped, which was either brilliant security design or her personal definition of a nightmare. The formal reception was held in a chamber the size of a cathedral, if cathedrals were grown from living crystal, and hummed at a frequency that made her back teeth vibrate. 30 species had representatives here, some she recognized. From briefings, most she did not, all of them jockeying for trade agreements and political access to the Sithari ascendancy, with the kind of elegant desperation that made diplomacy look like a slow knife fight, where everyone pretended the knives were handshakes. Cade was furniture. She stood 2 steps behind Ambassador Lowe, who called everything mutually beneficial, like the phrase owed him money. And she counted ceiling tiles, 47 visible, 8 obscured by a hanging light structure that looked like a frozen explosion. And she counted weapons in the room, 11 visible sidearms on various species guards, 3 concealed pieces she spotted from holster bulges and bad posture, and 1 Kathani delegate whose entire left arm was a weapon, which she appreciated for its honesty. Nobody looked at her. This was fine. Nobody had looked at her in any way that mattered for 2 years. Not since Rethus 4. Not since the Inquiry Board had used words like sole survivor and tactical breakdown and insufficient intelligence, as though those phrases could be stacked into a shape that explained why she was standing here, and 7 people she had trained with and bled with and known the middle names of were not. The Sithari Queen sat on a throne that grew from the floor, literally grew, the palace responding to the monarch's presence like a dog pressing against its owner's leg. And she was 7 feet of insectoid elegance, chitin plates layered over elongated limbs, a crest of bioluminescent markings, crowning her skull that shifted color and patterns Cade's translator flagged as emotional communication, nuance beyond translation parameters. Queen Valeth Sorai had held the ascendancy together through 3 civil fractures and an extermination war. Cade respected that in the way soldiers respect anything that survives long enough to become legend. The reception ended, and Cade prepared to escort Ambassador Lowe back to the human delegation quarters and then sit in her assigned room and stare at a wall that might stare back, which passed for entertainment on this station. That is not what happened. A Sithari royal guard approached her. Not Lowe, not the delegation lead, not anyone with authority or rank or a title that filled more than 1 line on a business card. Her, specifically. By name, spoken in harmonic tones that her cochlear implant flattened into something that sounded like her name being sung by a cello. Sergeant Marin Cade, the Sovereign requests your presence. Lo looked at her with the expression of a man who had been passed over for a promotion he didn't know existed. And Cade followed the guard without explanation, because she had learned a long time ago that when something unexpected happened, the best move was to walk toward it with your hands free and your eyes open. The corridors deepened. The bioluminescent veins in the walls shifted from pale blue to something darker, a color her eyes didn't have a name for, and the hum of the palace changed pitch, lower, more private, the architectural equivalent of a whispered conversation. They descended into the neural core of the station, where the walls were thicker, and the air tasted like ozone and something organic, like standing inside a living throat. The guard stopped at a chamber entrance and gestured her forward and did not follow. Cade stepped inside. The queen was alone. No advisors, no attendants, no ceremonial guard. Nothing but Valet Sori standing in a room that pulsed with her crest colors. And this was wrong. Deeply and fundamentally wrong, because Sithari monarchs were never unattended, the way human hearts were never supposed to stop. It was a rule so basic that breaking it meant something had already gone catastrophically sideways. And beside the queen, held by the shoulders with hands that were gentle in the way that only terrified hands can be gentle, stood a girl. Small for a Sithari, she barely reached Cade's chest, her chitin plates still carrying the slightly translucent quality of adolescence, her crest markings dim and unfinished, flickering in patterns the translator tagged as distress, anger, fear, anger, in rapid rotation. Princess Uranette Sori looked at Cade the way someone looks at a stain on an expensive floor. The queen spoke, not through the diplomatic translation system, not through filtered harmonics, designed to flatten meaning into something polite and manageable. She spoke raw, full spectrum, and Cade's cochlear implant screamed and crackled and nearly gave out, trying to process sound that was never meant for human hardware. But she caught it. 3 words, dragged from harmonic complexity into blunt meaning that landed in her skull like stones dropped into still water. Keep her safe. Then Queen Violet Sori, sovereign of the Sithari Ascendancy, ruler of 11 star systems and architect of 3 impossible pieces, did something no Sithari royal had ever done to a human in the recorded history of either species. She bowed. Not a diplomatic nod, not a gesture of mutual respect between equals, a bow, deep and slow and full of something Cade's translator couldn't touch, but her gut understood perfectly. Cade had seen that look before. On Rethys 4. On the faces of people who had already done the math on their own survival and come up with a number they had accepted, and were now spending their last unbroken moments making sure someone else's number came out different. The queen straightened and left the chamber without another word, and the walls shifted behind her, sealing the corridor, and Cade was alone with a princess who was looking at her with enough contempt to strip paint. Uranette spoke in clipped harmonics that the translator rendered with savage accuracy. Small and soft, and you smell like chemical flowers, and I do not understand why my mother has lost her mind. Cade looked at this alien child princess, who was radiating fury like a reactor with a cracked casing. And she did what she always did when the world handed her something impossible. She ran inventory. Exits, 2, both sealed. Weapons in the room, none visible. Threats, uncountable. Assets, 1 angry human with bad knees and a kid who hated her. Well, Cade said to no one in particular, that's a whole situation. Cade did not wait for official channels, because official channels were where people went to die slowly while filling out forms. She moved within the hour. The Sithari Palace monitored every corridor, every chamber, every breath of recycled air through the Queen's neural network. But it did not monitor the human-built maintenance tunnels that connected the embassy docking bay to the lower service levels, because those tunnels were constructed from bolted steel and polymer sheeting, and they were ugly and utilitarian, and the Sithari had looked at them the way a cathedral looks at a tool shed, beneath notice. Cade had spent 2 weeks on this station, doing nothing but walking corridors and counting exits, and memorizing the gap between what the Sithari watched and what they ignored, because that was what she did when she could not sleep, which was always. And now that useless habit was the only thing standing between a princess and whatever was coming. "Are we going?" Uraneth demanded, as Cade pulled her through a maintenance hatch that required ducking, which the princess did with the offended grace of someone who had never been asked to duck in her life. "Quiet," Cade said. "I will not be quiet. I am the heir to the ascendancy, and you are a— my translator does not have a word small enough for what you are. Try harder later. Right now, quiet." The tunnel smelled like copper and old sealant, and the particular flavor of human engineering that prioritized function over everything else, including dignity. And Cade moved through it with the ease of someone who had grown up in places exactly like this. The mining tunnels of Dust 7, where she had learned to walk before she learned that most people lived under open sky. The shuttle was where she had left it. Docking Bay 7, lower level, a decommissioned recon craft called the Lian, that looked like someone had built a spaceship out of spite, and it was human-made from nose to tail, boxy, graceless, welded in places where welding had no business being a solution, with a cockpit that smelled like recycled air and old coffee, because the air filtration system had given up on removing the coffee smell approximately 6 years ago, and everyone had accepted this as a feature rather than a flaw. Cade strapped Uraneth into the co-pilot seat, which required adjusting the harness for a body shaped nothing like a human's, and the princess sat rigid with fury and fear in equal measure, her crest markings flickering in agitated patterns that painted the cockpit walls in shifting color. "This vehicle is primitive," Uraneth said. "Yep. It smells terrible. That's the coffee. You get used to it." "I will not get used to anything about this situation, because this situation is temporary and insane, and my mother has clearly—" Cade fired the engines, and the Lian lurched out of the docking bay, with all the elegance of a kicked brick, and Uraneth stopped talking, because the acceleration pressed her into the seat with a force that her adolescent chitin plates were not designed to enjoy. They cleared the palace's sensor perimeter in 4 minutes. In 6 minutes, Cade engaged the stealth suite, a system that worked not by making the shuttle invisible, but by making it look like debris, which was easy because it already looked like debris. In 11 minutes, they were in open space, running dark, and the Sithari orbital palace was a shrinking glow behind them, like a dying ember. Cade exhaled. Then she started doing math. Not the kind of math that won battles or impressed commanders. The ugly kind, the survival kind, the kind she had learned on Rethys 4 when supplies ran out and hope followed shortly after. Uraneth was Sithari. Her biology required a different atmospheric mix than standard human air, heavier in nitrogen compounds, elements that the Lian's life support had never heard of and would not provide without modification. Cade had 14 hours before the princess's spiracles, the breathing structures along her ribcage, would begin to degrade in human standard atmosphere. She opened the maintenance panel beneath the console and started working. Duct tape, 3 rolls, standard military issue, capable of holding together everything from broken equipment to broken people in Cade's extensive experience. A water filtration unit she had pulled from the embassy quarters before leaving, not because she had planned this, but because she always carried things she might need the way some people carried worry, constantly and without thinking. Wiring from the secondary communication array she would not be using because communicating with anyone right now was the same as painting a target on the shuttle's hull. She rebuilt the air system in 2 hours. It was not elegant. Looked like someone had performed surgery on the shuttle using only determination and adhesive. But when she activated it, The atmospheric readout shifted towards something the translation database said was tolerable for Sci-Fi adolescent biology, which was not the same as comfortable, but was a universe away from dead. Rehearsed long before it was needed. Pale Reach. The name surfaced in Cade's mind, with the weight of a briefing she had read 6 months ago, and dismissed as somebody else's problem. A multi-species coalition that did not invade civilizations, but collapsed them from within, using informants and assassins and cultural poison applied with surgical patience until the body politic ate itself alive. They had come for the Scytheri. The Queen had known. That was why the bow. That was why the raw, unfiltered speech, and the sealed corridor, and the look in her eyes that Cade recognized from a place she did not visit in her memory if she could help it. Valeth had known she was already caught in the machine, and the only thing she could do was throw her daughter clear of the gears. Uraneth was staring at the intercepted signal on the datapad, her crest markings cycling through colors so fast they blurred into something like white, and her hands, four-fingered, chitinous, still carrying the slight tremor of adolescent growth, gripped the armrest hard enough to crack the polymer. "Is my mother alive?" Cade said, because the signal said sovereign detained, which was political language for alive but not for long, and she would give the kid that word for as long as she could. "How do you know?" "Because dead queens don't get detained. They get announced." Uraneth processed this with the terrible speed of a young mind encountering real danger for the first time, and her crest went dark, all color draining away in what Cade's limited understanding of Sci-Fi biology recognized as a stress response, the adolescent equivalent of shutting down. The princess's eyes closed, and her body went rigid and then limp, a torpor response, her biology pulling her under like a circuit breaker, tripping to prevent overload. Cade caught her before she slid out of the harness. She adjusted the seat to recline. The atmospheric readout confirmed the modified air system was holding, and then she sat back in the pilot's seat and opened her datapad and began running scenarios. Route options, 7, if she counted the ones that required flying through contested space, which she did because she counted everything. Fuel, enough for one of those 7 routes, maybe 2 if she cut life support to minimum during sleep cycles. Allies, none she could reach without broadcasting her position. Weapons, 1 service pistol, 3 charge packs, a combat knife she kept in her boot out of habit, and whatever she could build from shuttle components if things got creative. She ran the numbers, and the numbers were not good, but they were not 0, and she had worked with worse. She had worked with worse on Rethus 4, when the numbers said everyone dies, and she had disagreed with the numbers on a fundamental level that went beyond mathematics into something stubborn and animal. Human. 12 hours later, Uraneth woke from torpor and found Cade exactly where she had been. Pilot's seat, datapad open, eyes red from not blinking enough, running the same scenarios for the 100th time, looking for the crack in the wall she could push through. The princess looked at the sergeant, and for the first time since they had met, she did not insult her. "Will my mother die?" she asked, and the harmonics came through the translator so quietly that Cade almost did not hear them. Cade reached into the supply kit and pulled out a ration bar she had spent an hour modifying, scraping off the protein coating that would be toxic to Sci-Fi digestion, adding a nutrient paste from the medical kit that approximated something edible for the princess's biology. She held it out. "Eat," she said. Uraneth took the ration bar. The non-answer filled the cockpit-like atmosphere, present, necessary, and impossible to breathe. Relay 11 looked like someone had built a gas station in the void of space and then forgotten to tear it down. A refueling depot bolted to an asteroid on the edge of contested territory, all exposed piping and dented hull plates, and the particular smell of engine coolant and cheap protein that meant humans had been living somewhere too long, with too little budget and too much stubbornness to leave. Cade knew this place. Not this specific station, but this specific kind of place, the way anyone who grew up in the colonies knew the architecture of making do, of duct tape economies and repurposed junk, and people who stayed, not because the living was good, but because leaving felt like losing. She docked the Liane in a bay so small, the shuttle barely fit, and the docking clamps grabbed the hull with a sound like a handshake between two things that were both falling apart. "Stay here," she told Uraneth. "No," came the reply. "That was not a suggestion," Kane said. "I am the heir to the ascendancy. I do not take suggestions or orders from. You take them from the person keeping you alive, which today is me, which means you stay in this shuttle until I know what is out there." Uraneth's crest flickered hot white, the color of defiance, Cade had learned, or possibly indigestion. The translator was unclear. But she stayed. The station interior matched the exterior. Corridors wide enough for cargo haulers, lighting that buzzed at a frequency designed to give headaches to anyone who stayed longer than a week, and people who looked like they'd been staying longer than a week for years. Miners with hands stained permanent gray from asteroid dust. Haulers with the bow-legged walk of people who spent too much time in variable gravity. A few retired military types running what passed for a bar, in a place where the concept of ambiance had been replaced by the concept of enough. Cade found the supply depot first, restocked water filtration. Elements, protein base she could modify for Scythari biology. Medical patches for her wrist, which had been making a sound when she moved it that wrists should not make. Then she found the bar. It was called The Last Pour, which was either a name chosen for poetic resonance or because the owner had given up on thinking of something better. And inside were 6 people who looked like they had been poured there themselves, settled into chairs and corners with the permanence of furniture. 3 of them were retired military. Cade could tell from the posture, the way they sat with their backs to walls and their eyes on doors, a habit that never left, no matter how many years separated you from the last time it mattered. A woman at the bar had gray hair cut short and practical, and was missing 2 fingers on her left hand, and was drinking something amber from a metal cup, with the calm of someone who had decided a long time ago that the universe could do what it wanted. She would do what she wanted, and they would see who blinked first. Her name, Cade would learn in approximately 4 minutes, was Cortez. But first, she needed fuel cycling for the Liane, which took 12 hours minimum, and during those 12 hours, she and Uraneth would be stationary, visible, and vulnerable in a way that made her inventory-counting brain light up like a fretboard. She was running exit strategies when she saw him. A Valthari, gray-skinned, tall, dressed in the dull uniform of a trade auditor, standing near the docking registry and reviewing ship manifests with the bored professionalism of someone doing a tedious job. Except he looked at Uraneth's docking bay 1 second too long. 1 second. Most people would not have caught it. It was the kind of micro-expression, the kind of fractional attention shift that disappeared into the normal rhythm of someone scanning a list. Cade caught it, because catching things like that was the only reason she was alive, and 7 other people were not. The auditor was Pale Reach. She did not know this the way intelligence analysts know things, with data and confirmation and verified sources. She knew it the way prey knows a predator has entered the field, with the part of her brain that had been rewired on Rethys 4 to treat 1-second glances as the difference between breathing and not breathing. She walked into the last pour and sat down next to Cortez and ordered whatever was cheapest and said 4 sentences. "There is an alien kid on my shuttle. She is a princess and people are trying to kill her. I need 12 hours for fuel cycling. I will owe you whatever you want." Cortez looked at her. The look lasted 3 seconds, an eternity in the language of people who had spent their lives making fast decisions about who to trust. And in those 3 seconds, Cortez read Cade the way Cade had read the auditor. Weight behind them, the posture, the eyes, the particular quality of desperation that only shows up in people who are telling the truth, because they do not have enough time to construct a lie. 12 hours, Cortez said, and took a sip from her metal cup, and set it down with a sound like a gavel. Then you buy us beer." She did not ask for details. She did not ask for proof, or credentials, or official authorization, or any of the things that reasonable people ask before agreeing to put themselves between a stranger's problem and whatever sharp thing was causing it. She turned to the two other veterans at the bar, a man named Dawes, who had a mechanical leg, and a woman named Priya, who had the kind of quiet about her that suggested she had seen things that had made noise unnecessary. And she said, "We have something," and they both stood up, and that was it. That was the entire recruitment process. No hive network, no pheromone bonds, no crest authority. No genetic imperative. 3 humans in a bar on the edge of nowhere heard that a child was in danger, and decided that this was now their problem, because someone had looked them in the eye and asked. Cade went back to the shuttle and told Uraneth to stay below the viewport line and eat another ration bar, and Uraneth said something in untranslated harmonics that was probably an insult, but might have been a question. And Cade was already moving, because the auditor was going to make his call soon, if he had not already. And 12 hours was a long time when someone knew where you were parked. The call came 6 hours in. Cade had positioned herself near the communications relay, a rusted assembly of dishes and signal boosters bolted to the station's exterior hull. And she watched the auditor transmit a coded burst to a frequency her interceptor identified as Pale Reach operational. 4 hours later, 3 figures docked at the station's secondary bay, in a shuttle that was too clean and too quiet for a place like Relay 11. 2 Sithari, defectors from the Ascendancy, based on their modified pressed markings, the colors scraped and recolored in patterns that meant they had renounced their allegiance. And 1 Kethani, a species Cade knew primarily from weapons briefings, whose left arm ended not in a hand, but in a bio-integrated plasma assembly that could cut through hull plating at close range. A kill team, professional, quiet, and moving toward the docking bay where the Liane sat with an alien princess inside who was probably insulting the upholstery. Cortez was waiting for them at the corridor junction. Not with a weapon, with a wrench, a heavy thing meant for hull bolt maintenance, and she held it the way a person holds something they have used before for purposes the manufacturer did not intend. Dawes was behind them, his mechanical leg clicking on the deck plates with a rhythm that announced his position, because he did not care if they knew he was there. Priya was above, on the maintenance catwalk, with a cargo hook and the silence of someone who understood that the best position in a fight was the one nobody was looking at. The first Sithari defector came around the corner and met the wrench. Cortez was 60 years old and missing 2 fingers, and she swung that wrench like she was driving a railroad spike, and the sound it made against chitinous armor was a sound Cade would remember for a long time. Heavy and wet and final. The second defector drew a blade, a curved Sithari thing designed for the joints in human armor, and put it through Cortez's shoulder, and Cortez did not stop swinging. She did not scream or fall or freeze. She shifted her weight, adjusted her grip with the 3 fingers she had left on that hand, and brought the wrench around again, because stopping was not something her body understood how to do when there was still someone standing who meant harm to someone she had decided to protect. The Kethani raised his plasma arm, and Cade shot him. 3 rounds from a service pistol, center mass, at a range close enough that she could smell the ozone from the plasma assembly charging, and the recoil did something to her wrist that sent a white flash of pain from her hand to her shoulder that she filed away for later, under the category of problems that required being alive to solve. The Kethani went down. Priya dropped from the catwalk onto the second defector with the cargo hook, and a degree of commitment that suggested she had been waiting for something like this to happen for a while. It was over in 90 seconds. It was not graceful or cinematic or anything that would look impressive in a report. It was messy and loud, and Cortez was bleeding through her jacket, and Dawes was sitting on the floor because his mechanical leg had locked up at the knee joint. And Priya was breathing hard and staring at the cargo hook in her hands like she was surprised by what she had done with it. Cade splinted her wrist with electrical tape from her pocket. She always carried electrical tape the way Cortez always carried a wrench, as a statement of philosophy. And she walked back to the liane and opened the hatch. Uranith was pressed against the far wall of the cockpit, crest dark, eyes wide, and she had heard everything through the hull. Every impact, every shout, every sound that meant violence was happening inches away on the other side of the metal that separated her from a universe that wanted her dead. Cade stepped inside, blood on her collar, not hers, wrist taped, hands steady, face carrying nothing that the princess could read as fear or triumph, or anything other than the flat calm of someone who had finished a task and moved on to the next one. Uranith looked at her and moved to make room in the co-pilot seat. A small thing, a shift of weight, pulling in of limbs, the creation of space where before there had been only territorial refusal. She had never made room for anyone before. Cade sat down and began the fuel cycle startup sequence, and did not mention the blood, and did not mention the fight, and did not mention Cortez or the wrench or any of it. "Your vehicle still smells terrible," Uranith said. "Yeah," Cade said. Outside the viewport, the stars did not care about any of them, which was fine, because the people inside the station had cared enough to make up the difference. The Loyalist cell was hidden beneath the surface of a neutral moon that had no name, only a designation, KR7, which was the kind of name given to places nobody was supposed to care about. 12 Scytheri waited in a cavern system carved from volcanic rock, their crest markings glowing in the darkness like a constellation that had fallen underground and kept burning. And when Uranith stepped off the liane and into the tunnel entrance, they made a sound. Cade's cochlear implant nearly overloaded trying to process it. A harmonic reverberation that came from 12 throats at once, layered and subsonic, and resonant in ways that vibrated her ribcage and made her eyes water. And her translator offered a single inadequate word for what it meant: recognition. But it was more than that. It was the sound of a species finding something it had been afraid it had lost. The sound of relief so deep it had its own frequency. And Uranith walked into it like walking into warm water, and her crest, her dim, unfinished, adolescent crest, flickered to life in response, colors blooming across her skull in patterns Cade had never seen before. The princess was home. Sort of. Cade stood at the tunnel entrance and watched, and knew with the certainty of someone who had spent her life being the wrong shape for the room she was in, that her part of this was nearly over. The Loyalists were kind to her. The Scythari had a deep cultural framework for honoring service, and they treated Cade with formal respect that was sincere and warm, and also unmistakably a form of thank you and goodbye, wrapped in the same gesture. She was furniture again. Useful furniture that had performed its function and could now be returned to the storage room, where furniture belonged when it was not needed. Cade sat in a corner of the cavern and cleaned her pistol, field-stripped it, wiped each component, reassembled it with hands that moved from memory, while her mind did something else. And she counted the things she could count, because counting was the rope she held when everything else was current and undertow. The Loyalists communicated in ways she could not access, subsonic harmonics below her hearing range, pheromone exchanges her human biology could not detect, chromatic shifts in their crest markings that carried entire conversations, in colors she could see but not read. She was locked out of the room while standing in it. This was not cruelty. It was biology. The simple fact that she was a different kind of creature, and the gap between her senses and theirs was a canyon that no amount of goodwill could bridge. The Loyalist commander was named Sethrin, tall even for a Scythari, battle-scarred, with crest markings that had been damaged on one side, and healed into something asymmetric and fierce. and he spread a holographic tactical map across the cavern floor and briefed the cell in full harmonic range. While Cade's translator caught maybe 60% of the meaning and filled the rest with context unavailable. What she caught was enough. The Queen was alive, detained in the palace's neural core, the same chamber where she had handed Uranith to Cade, surrounded by the puppet council and their pale reach handlers who needed Valeth breathing because a dead queen was a martyr and a living queen was leverage. The coup's legitimacy was fragile, held together by the 3 defecting Crest advisors and a carefully managed narrative being broadcast to the outer colonies that painted the transition as voluntary, as the Queen stepping aside for the good of the Ascendancy, as peaceful and correct and nothing to worry about. It was a lie that worked only as long as nobody important stood up and called it a lie. Uranith was important. If the princess appeared before the Ascendancy, publicly, on broadcast, undeniable, and declared the transition illegitimate, the narrative collapsed, and the loyalist cells across 11 star systems would have the signal they needed to act. The plan required Uranith to return to the capital, into the palace that had been turned into a cage, into a throne room full of people who wanted her dead, or controlled, or silent. Sethrin laid out the operation in precise harmonic detail, and every Sithari in the cavern looked at the princess, and she looked back at them, and her crest was burning with colors that Kane's translator could not name, but her gut understood. The girl was terrified, and she was going to do it anyway. Cade listened through her translator's partial rendering, and when Sethrin finished, she asked one question. What is the survival probability for the kid? Sethrin gave her a number. The number was not good. Cade nodded once, the way she always nodded when the math was bad. A single downward motion that acknowledged the reality. Agreeing to accept it, and then she stood up and walked to the holographic map and started talking. She did not touch the politics. She understood instinctively that the political architecture of this plan was Sithari business. Built from cultural logic and hierarchical codes she had no right to reshape. She touched the geometry. Entry points. The palace's living architecture rearranged constantly, but the human-built maintenance tunnels remained fixed, because the Sithari neural network did not interface with human construction, which meant the same invisible pathways Cade had used to extract Uranith could be used to insert her. Timing windows. The Puppet Council's broadcast schedule created predictable moments when the throne room's security would be configured for transmission rather than defense, prioritizing signal integrity over physical containment. Sightlines. Based on Cade's 2 weeks of obsessive corridor mapping, she could identify 3 positions in the throne chamber where a person could stand and be simultaneously visible to the broadcast array and shielded from direct fire by the chamber's structural columns. She turned the Loyalists' political gambit into a tactical operation, with the same energy she would use to fix a broken fuel line. Not because she thought it was simple, but because treating complicated things as mechanical problems was how her brain stayed functional when the stakes made other people's brains freeze. The Scythari watched her work. They had never seen planning like this. Not a hive calculation, not a Crest Authority directive handed down through harmonic consensus, but a single mind, running through chaos like it was a maze, testing every wall for weakness, discarding dead ends with the speed of someone who had spent years inside mazes where standing still meant dying. Sethrin's crest shifted to a color Cade's translator flagged as reassessment, upward, interpreted as the alien equivalent of, okay. The plan came together in 3 hours. Uranith would enter through the maintenance tunnels, emerge into the throne room during a broadcast window, deliver her declaration in full harmonic range, and the broadcast signal, which the Puppet Council could not cut without revealing that they were suppressing the heir's voice, would carry her words to every colony in the Ascendancy. Cade would walk her in. Cade would walk her out. The number Sethrin had given her for survival probability would either change or it would not. And either way, Cade would be standing between the princess and whatever came through the door, because that was the job. And the job was the only thing she had left that made the math work. The night before the operation, Cade went to the surface. The moon had no atmosphere worth mentioning. She stood in a pressure suit near the tunnel exit, and looked up at a sky full of stars she did not recognize because they were arranged for a part of the galaxy that had never been her home, and never would be. She heard the airlock cycle behind her, and she did not turn around because she already knew who it was. The footsteps were too light and too sharp, chitin on stone, the walk of someone who had not yet grown into the weight they would one day carry. Uranette stood beside her and looked up at the same sky, and her crest markings, for the first time since Cade had met her, glowed in a sustained pattern, not flickering, not cycling through emotions like a broken signal, but holding steady in a color that was deep and warm, and unlike anything Cade had seen the princess produce before. They stood there for a while. Neither of them spoke. The next morning Sethrin pulled Cade aside and told her what the color meant. He explained it carefully, using his translator to ensure accuracy, because the concept did not map cleanly onto any human word. Scythari term that described a bond formed not through blood or hive connection or crest lineage, but through the specific and rare act of being chosen by someone who had every reason not to choose you. The closest human translation was 3 words long, family not of blood. Cade listened. She thanked Sethrin for telling her. She went back to her corner of the cavern and picked up her pistol and began cleaning it again, because her hands needed to be doing something, and the something they wanted to do was shake, and she would not allow that. Her hands were always steady. That was the trick. Not that she felt nothing, but that the feeling went somewhere other than her hands, somewhere deep and locked and unvisited. And the pistol came apart and went back together, and came apart and went back together, and the rhythm of it was the rope, and the rope held. Across the cavern, Uranith was speaking with Sethrin about the operation, her voice carrying harmonics that were stronger than they had been 3 weeks ago, and her crest was still glowing that same warm, steady color. And she did not look at Cade. She did not need to. The color said everything her voice would not. They entered the Scythari capital, the way humans had been entering places for as long as the species existed. Through the door, nobody was watching. A trade delegation from a minor human commerce outpost, carrying cargo manifests and docking permits that were real enough to survive a surface scan, filed into the palace's lower commercial level, in a shuttle that was not the Lian, but looked enough like every other human trade vessel that the difference was invisible. Cade had called in every favor she possessed, and several she did not. 2 of those favors were standing behind her. Volunteers from Relay 11, who had not been asked, and had shown up at the rendezvous point anyway, because Cortez had sent word through channels that did not officially exist, that something was happening, and people were needed. A man named Torres, who had served 20 years in fleet engineering, and now fixed water recyclers on frontier stations for a living. Plasma cutter, and a calm that suggested he had been waiting for a reason to use both. A woman named Park, who had never explained what she did before Relay 11, and who carried no visible weapons, but moved through spaces in a way that made Cade trust her immediately and completely. Torres had also brought beer, 2 cans, dented, warm, stashed in his jacket pocket. For after, he said. Cade did not smile, but something in her face changed that Torres read correctly as the closest she was going to get. The maintenance tunnels were exactly where Cade's memory said they would be, unchanged, unmonitored, invisible to the palace's living architecture, because they were made of dead materials that the neural network could not feel. Human steel bolted to human polymer in human patterns that the most advanced alien civilization in this sector had looked at and dismissed as beneath calculation. They moved through them in silence, Cade on point, Uraneth behind her, Park behind the princess, Torres at the rear, and the tunnel walls were cold and smelled like old sealant, and the particular flavor of being somewhere you were not supposed to be. Uranet's crest was dark, deliberately suppressed, Cade understood, to avoid detection by the palace's chromatic sensors. And the effort of holding her bioluminescence down was visible, in the tension of her jaw and the slight tremor in her hands. "Breathe," Cade said without turning around. "I am breathing. Breathe like you mean it." A small sharp sound from behind her, that might have been a laugh, or might have been a Sithari expression of contempt, that happened to sound identical to a laugh. And Cade chose to interpret it as the first one. The throne chamber was ahead. She could feel it through the tunnel walls, a vibration that had no sound, the neural network's pulse growing stronger as they approached the heart of the palace, where power had lived for centuries, and now lived under new and illegitimate management. Cade checked her pistol. 9 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, a number she had known for hours, but confirmed again, because confirmation was free and surprises were expensive. She checked her wrist, still taped, still functional, still making a sound when she rotated it that she had decided to interpret as enthusiasm rather than structural failure. She checked the time. The broadcast window opened in 4 minutes, during which the throne room's security configuration would prioritize signal transmission over physical defense. And in that window, Uraneth would walk into the most dangerous room in the Ascendancy and open her mouth and either change history or become part of it in a way that no one in this tunnel wanted to think about. "Cade," Uraneth said. Period. It was the first time the princess had used her name. Not sergeant, not human, not any of the 12 Sithari words for small and soft and beneath. Notice, her name, spoken in harmonics that the translator rendered with a warmth that made Cade's chest do something she did not have time to process. Yeah. Thank you. 2 words, the minimum viable unit of an emotion so large that saying more would have broken something neither of them could afford to break right now. Cade nodded once. "Stay behind me. When I stop, you speak. When I move, you move. When I tell you to run, I will not run." "Yeah," Cade said. "I figured." The access panel was a square of human-manufactured steel set into the base of the throne chamber's eastern wall, hidden behind a structural column that the Sithari had built around without absorbing because dead metal could not be integrated into living architecture. Cade opened it. The throne room hit her senses like a wave. Vast, luminous, the walls pulsing with the deep rhythmic glow of the palace's neural heartbeat, and in the center of it, the puppet. Council sat in a semicircle of grown crystal seats that had been the Queen's court, and was now a stage for a performance nobody in the outer colonies had been told was fiction. 3 crested visors in ceremonial positions, their markings displaying authority colors, flanked by attendants and guards, and Cade counted in the 2 seconds she had before the broadcast window opened, 14 armed personnel. A number that confirmed this was not just a political session, but a fortified position disguised as governance. The broadcast array was active, crystal-based Sithari technology that transmitted across the Ascendancy's entire communication network, carrying the Puppet Council's voice to every colony and station and ship. And in 30 seconds, it would carry something else entirely. Uraneth stepped past Cade, into the light, into the room, into the open space between the column and the Council's semicircle, where every eye and sensor and weapon in the chamber could find her. Her crest ignited, not the dim flickering of an unfinished adolescent hiding her light. A full ignition, colors pouring up from her skull in patterns that Cade could not read, but that every Sithari in the room could, and the effect was immediate and electric, guards turning, advisors rising, the rhythm of the chamber cracking open like an egg. Uraneth spoke. Full harmonic range, unfiltered, uncompressed, the raw layered sound that Sithari used for declarations that were meant to be felt in the bones of every listener. And Cade's translator caught the meaning in fragments. Her mother's name, the word illegitimate, the word no, repeated 3 times in rising harmonic registers that the broadcast array carried live and uncut to 11 star systems. The Puppet Council froze for 1.3 seconds, Cade counted, because they could not cut the broadcast without revealing that they were silencing the air, which would destroy the narrative of voluntary transition faster than anything Uraneth could say. 1.3 seconds of hesitation. Then, the kill teams activated. 3 of them, emerging from positions Cade had identified on the holographic map, and mentally flagged as probable hostile staging points. Armed with weapons designed for close-quarters precision, moving toward the princess with the coordinated efficiency of people who had rehearsed this specific scenario. Cade stepped in front of Uraneth. She was shorter than every Sithari in the room by at least a foot. A blunt, soft-skinned, dull-eyed creature with no crest markings, no bioluminescence, no chipness armor, and no harmonic voice. She had a service pistol with 9 rounds, and a wrist held together with electrical tape, and 34 years of refusing to agree with math that said she should be dead. The room stopped. Not because she was impressive, not because the sight of a single human with a sidearm presented a tactical obstacle to 3 professional kill teams armed with weapons that could cut through hull plating. The room stopped because every Sithari in it, loyalist and traitor and undecided, felt something they had no cultural framework for, something their hive logic and crest authority and collective resonance patterns had never modeled. A creature that was outmatched by every metric their civilization used to measure threat, had placed itself between their princess and death, and was not bluffing, and was not calculating, and was not making a strategic decision. It was making a choice that existed outside strategy entirely, a choice that lived in the part of human biology that the Sithari had studied for decades and never understood. The part that did not ask whether the wall would hold, but simply became the wall, and let the question answer itself. Cade racked the slide on her pistol. The sound was small and mechanical, and it cut through the harmonic richness of the throne room like a stone dropped into music. A human sound, ugly and precise, that meant what it meant in every language and every culture that had ever built a weapon. 9 rounds. 3 kill teams. She had done worse math. The first kill team member moved, and Cade fired twice, and Park was there, appearing from the maintenance access like a shadow with weight, hitting the second team from an angle they had not expected, because they had not been looking for threats emerging from dead metal tunnels that their intelligence said were irrelevant. Torres came through behind Park, with his plasma cutter running hot, and a look on his face that said he had been fixing water recyclers for 5 years, and that was enough of that. The broadcast was still running. Every colony in the Ascendancy was watching. They saw the princess stand her ground, and they saw a human stand in front of her. And they saw 2 more humans come out of the walls, like something the palace itself had summoned. And the loyalist cells, all of them, across 11 systems, received the signal they had been waiting for. And the Ascendancy's fleet fractured like ice under a hammer, 60% breaking for the true crown. The Puppet Council collapsed in hours. The Pale Reach's carefully constructed narrative of legitimate transition dissolved under the weight of a live broadcast, showing the air defiant, and a human with a pistol standing between her and annihilation. The Queen was extracted from the neural core by loyalist forces. She found her daughter in the throne room, standing in the place where power lived, crest burning bright, unfinished and unbroken. She found Cade in a medical bay 2 levels down, sitting on a table that was too tall for human anatomy, letting a Sithari medic set her wrist properly for the first time in 3 weeks, and complaining about the quality of alien painkillers with the dry focus of someone who had opinions about analgesics and was not going to keep them private. Valith entered the medical bay. Cade tried to stand, the reflex of a soldier in the presence of a sovereign, muscle memory deeper than pain, and the Queen placed a hand on her shoulder. The first voluntary physical contact between a Sithari monarch and a human in the recorded history of either species. She pushed Cade gently back down onto the table. Vaylet's crest glowed, the same color as her daughter's, deep and warm and steady, the color that meant family, not of blood. And Cade looked at it, and her translator did not need to tell her what it meant, because she had already learned this word in a language that did not use sound. The Queen left without speaking, because there was nothing to say that the color had not already said. Cade sat in the medical bay. She ran her inventory one final time. The rope she always reached for, the habit that kept her hands steady, and her mind moving forward when everything else was current and pull. Exits, 1. Weapons, none needed. Threats, manageable. Assets, a kid who did not hate her anymore, and a galaxy that had just learned something about humans it would not forget. Not the technology, not the adaptability, not the fleet numbers or the trade routes or any of the things that showed up in intelligence briefings and diplomatic assessments. What they learned was smaller than that and larger than that. They learned that a human will stand in front of something they have chosen to love and refuse to move. And the refusal is not a tactic, and not a strategy, and not a calculated position. It is a fact, like gravity, like the speed of light, like the distance between stars that nothing can change and everything must account for. Cade closed her eyes. Her hands were in her lap. For the first time since Rethys 4, she did not count. She did not inventory the room, or map the exits, or calculate the threats. She just breathed and slept. And the stars outside, those unfamiliar, unnamed, impossibly distant stars that had never been hers, kept burning, the way they always had, the way they always would, indifferent to everything except the stubborn fact of their own light.